In January 2000, the town of Palestine, Texas, was shaken to its core. 84-year-old Geraldine Davidson, a retired schoolteacher, church organist, and beloved grandmother, was safe inside her own home, or so she thought. But that night, safety was stolen. Davidson was ambushed during a burglary, abducted, and forced into the trunk of her own car. Hours later, her lifeless body was discovered in the Neches River, weighted down with a cinder block. A woman who had given her life to faith and education was murdered in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. Her killer? 20-year-old Danielle Nathaniel Simpson, a troubled young man who claimed life on death row was worse than death itself. What followed was nearly a decade of trials, appeals, and a chilling countdown to execution. To understand how a kind widow's final moments turned into a community's worst nightmare, and to hear Simpson's last words from the death chamber, we have to go back to the beginning. Danielle Nathaniel Simpson was born on October 26, 1979, in Texas. A child who, like so many others, began life with endless possibilities but whose path would eventually spiral into tragedy and violence. Public records about his early years are scarce, but what we do know paints the picture of a young man growing up in East Texas, a place where small-town life often carries big challenges. From the start, Simpson's life was marked by instability and poor decisions, the kind that would slowly erode the boundaries between right and wrong. Those who encountered Simpson in his youth often described him as bright, someone with potential, even flashes of intelligence that could have led to something better. Yet that promise was shadowed by a pattern of discipline problems and impulsive choices. Teachers and neighbors saw a young man who could have walked a different road if he had the right guidance, but instead he became known for run-ins with trouble and a growing disregard for rules. By his teenage years, the signs of strain were clear. He struggled with direction, drifting into the margins of his community, increasingly drawn to the wrong influences. By the time Simpson was 20 years old, the foundation of his life was already fractured. Court documents and trial testimony would later show that he wasn't a hardened career criminal but rather a young man spiraling downward, unable, or unwilling, to pull himself back. His choices were shaped by impulsivity, short-term thinking, and a lack of regard for the consequences. The Danielle Simpson who stood in court was the product of years of small cracks that widened into a devastating fault line. Simpson's record only deepened that portrait. In 1999, he had been placed on 10 years deferred adjudication for indecency with a child. Witnesses described him as a member of a Palestine street gang tied to drug trafficking, assaults, robberies, and shootings. Testimony also linked him to several burglaries and incidents of violence, including assaults on his wife, Jennifer, and another female. In one particularly telling episode, Simpson smashed the windows of his own sister's car in a fit of rage. Each act further distanced him from redemption, showing a young man steadily building a reputation not just for recklessness, but for violence. And yet, for all his flaws, Simpson wasn't invisible. People who knew him personally said he was capable of holding a conversation, capable of understanding right from wrong, capable of making better decisions if he chose to. He wasn't a stranger to kindness, but discipline and structure never seemed to take hold. Instead, his life became a series of escalating mistakes, each one carrying him further away from redemption. On January 26, 2000, Danielle Nathaniel Simpson was just 20 years old, living in Anderson County with his 16-year-old wife, Jennifer, under the roof of his aunts. Just a few blocks away lived Geraldine "Jerry" Davidson, an 84-year-old widow, a former schoolteacher who had once guided generations of Palestine's children, and the longtime organist at her Methodist church. Geraldine was a woman of quiet dignity and faith, living out her later years alone, surrounded by the familiar streets of the community she had served for decades. But to Simpson, her home represented something very different: opportunity. He had burglarized her house at least 2 times before. And on that fateful July night, accompanied by Jennifer and a younger cousin, he decided to return once again. Their goal was simple: valuables, jewelry, quick money. They slipped into her home and began ransacking her belongings. For 15 minutes, the thieves quietly gathered what they could. Then came the moment that changed everything. Geraldine returned home. What followed was terrifying. Simpson crept up behind the elderly woman and pressed a knife to her neck. Demanding money, he forced her to dig into her purse and hand over cash. But it didn't end there. According to testimony, Simpson then ordered Jennifer and their young cousin to restrain Geraldine while he searched for duct tape and a pillowcase. When he returned, he bound her hands, taped her mouth, and instructed Jennifer to tape her legs. Finally, he slipped the pillowcase over Geraldine's head, hoisted her fragile body over his shoulder, and carried her outside, placing her into the trunk of her own car. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Witnesses later testified that Simpson drove around town with Geraldine still locked inside the trunk, opening it at times to show off his victim to friends, as though she were some kind of prize. For the terrified widow, it was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Trapped in darkness, bound and gagged, she could only listen to the sound of her captors laughing and the car rumbling beneath her. The night turned grotesque. At one point, the group even stopped at a fast food restaurant to eat hamburgers and French fries, while Geraldine remained imprisoned in the trunk. Her captors feasted, ignoring her suffering as though her life meant nothing. Eventually, their aimless drive ended at the banks of the Neches River. Geraldine, frail and disoriented, was dragged from the trunk. But instead of mercy, she was met with brutality. According to court testimony, Simpson ran toward her and kicked her in the face with such force that it knocked her down. Her captors then tied her legs, attaching the other end of the rope to a heavy cinder block. With chilling indifference, Simpson heaved the block into the water, pulling Geraldine with it. Bound, gagged, and helpless, she drowned in the murky river. Forensic experts would later confirm that she was alive when she hit the water. An 84-year-old woman who had devoted her life to teaching, music, and faith spent her last moments struggling beneath the surface, abandoned in darkness. The crime was not only cruel, it was senseless. A community that had once known Geraldine as a devoted teacher and the voice of their church organ now remembered her as the victim of one of the most shocking murders in East Texas history. She had survived 8 decades of life, only to be taken in her final years by a young man who lived just a few blocks away. Simpson's actions that night revealed more than just recklessness. They exposed a chilling disregard for human life. He wasn't content to steal jewelry or cash. He orchestrated a spectacle of domination and cruelty, parading an elderly widow like a trophy before extinguishing her life. In the span of just a few hours, he transformed from burglar to kidnapper to killer, forever altering the legacy of both himself and the woman who had once been his neighbor. The disappearance of Geraldine Davidson immediately sent shockwaves through Palestine, Texas, a quiet town where neighbors looked out for one another and where an elderly widow like her was seen as almost untouchable by harm. When Jerry failed to show up for her usual church commitments and routine errands, her friends and fellow congregants grew alarmed. Calls to her home went unanswered, and it was soon clear to those who knew her well that something was terribly wrong. Within hours, police officers were conducting welfare checks and canvassing the neighborhood, and the investigation began with a chilling discovery. Her home had been broken into, valuables were missing, and her car was nowhere to be found. To a small town like Palestine, the sight of police tape draped around the home of their beloved church organist was almost unthinkable, and rumors spread quickly that something sinister had happened. As investigators began piecing together the puzzle, clues mounted rapidly. Physical evidence of forced entry into Jerry's home supported the burglary theory, and neighbors reported seeing suspicious activity near her residence that day. What drew even sharper focus was the victim's missing car, which soon became the key to unraveling the mystery. Witnesses later testified that they had seen Simpson, then 20 years old, driving around town in Jerry's vehicle, even showing off the trunk to acquaintances in a twisted display that would later horrify the courtroom. Alongside these accounts, the police gathered testimony from those who had been with Simpson that night, and the story they told pointed in only one direction. The turning point came when investigators tracked down one of Simpson's close associates, who confessed under questioning and detailed the nightmarish events that had unfolded. This testimony, combined with corroborating physical evidence, including traces that tied Simpson directly to the burglary and abduction, gave law enforcement the confirmation they needed. When confronted, Danielle Nathaniel Simpson was arrested, and soon after he confessed, recounting in chilling detail how Geraldine Davidson had been bound, placed in her own trunk, and ultimately thrown into the river with a cinder block tied to her frail body. It was a confession that left even seasoned investigators shaken. The community of Palestine, Texas, was devastated. This was not the kind of crime they associated with their town, let alone one committed against a woman who had given her life to education, music, and faith. The image of Jerry, a kind, elderly widow, brutalized by someone who lived just blocks away, filled the town with anger and sorrow. As police cars rolled away with Danielle Simpson in custody, word spread quickly through the streets and churches of Palestine. For many, the sense of safety that had defined their small community was shattered forever, replaced by grief for Geraldine Davidson and disbelief that someone from their midst could commit such a cold and calculated act. When Danielle Nathaniel Simpson was formally charged with capital murder, The stage was set for one of the most emotionally charged trials in Anderson County's history. The courthouse in Palestine, Texas, filled with townspeople, journalists, and the grieving friends of Geraldine "Jerry" Davidson, who wanted to see justice served for the gentle 84-year-old church organist who had been so brutally taken from them. From the very beginning, the prosecution painted a vivid and devastating portrait of the crime, reminding the jury that this was not a case of impulse or accident but of deliberate cruelty. They walked the jurors step by step through the horrifying events of that July day: Simpson burglarizing Davidson's home, holding a knife to her neck, binding her with duct tape, gagging her, placing a pillowcase over her head, shoving her into the trunk of her own car, and then driving around town, opening the trunk to show off his victim before ultimately dragging her to the Neches River, where she was kicked in the face and drowned with a cinder block tied to her frail body. The prosecution's tone was relentless, stressing not only the brutality of the act but the utter disregard for human dignity Simpson displayed in treating Davidson's final hours as some sort of twisted performance. They brought in witnesses who recounted what Simpson had bragged about, and they underscored how Jerry Davidson, an elderly widow who had dedicated her life to teaching children and serving in her Methodist church, had lived a life of grace and service, only to die at the hands of someone half her age who had burglarized her home before. Prosecutors drove home that this was not just murder. It was a calculated act of terror against a defenseless woman who posed no threat whatsoever. On the other side of the courtroom, the defense team struggled to shift the narrative, asking the jury to consider Simpson's troubled upbringing, his youth — he was just 20 years old at the time of the crime — and possible mental health issues that may have impaired his judgment. They argued that while his actions were reprehensible, the circumstances of his background and his lack of maturity should weigh heavily against imposing the ultimate punishment. At times, they suggested that peer influence and the chaotic environment in which Simpson lived played a role in steering him toward such a violent outcome. But their arguments, though sympathetic on the surface, paled in comparison to the searing testimony of the prosecution's witnesses and the mountain of evidence that tied Simpson directly to the crime. Jurors listened, stone-faced, as graphic details were presented, and by the time closing arguments were made, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. The prosecution hammered home their final message. Geraldine Davidson had lived 84 years, surviving wars, raising generations of students, and serving her church faithfully, only to be dehumanized and discarded in a river by a man who showed no mercy. They told the jury that to allow Simpson to live while Davidson lay dead at the bottom of the Neches River would be to deny justice itself. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. With little hesitation they delivered their verdict: guilty of capital murder. The words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching, as Simpson showed little visible reaction. The penalty phase followed swiftly, and the same jury, after weighing the arguments, handed down the sentence that the community had been waiting for: death by lethal injection. Gasps echoed through the courtroom, followed by an almost palpable release of tension. After Danielle Nathaniel Simpson was sentenced to death, he was transferred to the Palustine unit in Livingston, Texas, the state's notorious facility that houses every man on death row. Here, life was not measured by days of freedom but by endless hours of silence, isolation, and the looming certainty of an execution date. In Palustine, inmates are confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour allowed for solitary recreation in a small, caged yard. There is no contact with other prisoners, no communal dining, no opportunities for work or education. Meals are pushed through a slot in a steel door, and any human contact is reduced to brief words exchanged with guards or attorneys. For Simpson, who had once lived chaotically and freely, this stark reality was suffocating. Like every inmate on death row, Simpson's case moved through a long chain of appeals, beginning with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and eventually making its way into the federal court system. His lawyers argued against his sentence, pointing to his youth at the time of the crime and raising issues around mental health and due process. But time and again, appellate judges upheld the original verdict, concluding that the brutality of his crime outweighed every mitigating factor the defense could offer. Each ruling brought him closer to the execution chamber in Huntsville. Then came a twist that startled even those who had followed his case closely. Simpson himself began to volunteer for execution. In filings to the courts, he admitted that the conditions on Texas death row were unbearable, describing the relentless isolation, sensory deprivation, and lack of human touch as worse than death itself. For him, the monotony of being locked alone in a concrete box, unable to hug his family or interact with other inmates, had become a torment that gnawed at his mind day after day. He told courts that execution would at least end what he described as a slow psychological death inside Palustine. This decision painted a grim picture of the psychological toll of nearly a decade on death row. Experts and activists have long argued that such conditions create mental anguish that borders on torture, and Simpson's own words seem to echo that view. He described the loneliness, the constant buzz of fluorescent lights, and the silence interrupted only by the sounds of distant footsteps or the occasional outburst from another prisoner. For Simpson, every appeal denied was not just another step toward execution but another year of living in an environment he saw as inhumane. Still, despite his earlier statements that he wanted the process to end quickly, Simpson's lawyers filed last-minute appeals as his execution date drew near, seeking to delay or overturn the decision on procedural grounds. Those efforts, however, failed to sway the courts. The path laid out for Danielle Simpson from the day the jury sentenced him to death in 2000 remained unchanged. After nearly 10 years of waiting in the stark isolation of Polunsky Unit, Simpson's time on death row was almost over, and the state of Texas prepared to carry out the sentence. As November 18, 2009 approached, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice made preparations for Danielle Nathaniel Simpson's execution at the Huntsville Walls Unit, the state's historic red brick prison that has witnessed more executions than any other facility in America. In those final hours, Simpson was granted the traditional privileges extended to the condemned: visits from loved ones, time with spiritual advisors, and one last meal of his choosing. For Simpson, that final meal was simple but telling: 4 pieces of fried chicken with gravy, biscuits, and a glass of milk. He ate alone in his holding cell, only a few feet away from the chamber where his life would soon end. That day, Simpson received visits from both family and clergy, and witnesses later noted that he seemed calm, almost resigned as he spoke to them. For his family, who had stood by him through years of trials and appeals, the weight of the day was unbearable, yet they listened as he told them he loved them and urged them to stay strong. The presence of clergy provided Simpson with the spiritual counsel he had requested, a final opportunity for prayer and reflection before facing the lethal injection chamber. Inside Huntsville, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Guards moved with quiet efficiency, their routines well practiced after decades of carrying out executions. Outside the prison's limestone walls, reporters gathered in clusters, cameras ready to capture the moment the execution would be confirmed. Across the street, demonstrators, some for, some against the death penalty, held signs and candles, their chants mixing with the sound of traffic on Highway 190. Inside, however, the world narrowed for Simpson to a single countdown. As the clock moved toward 6 p.m., he was led from his holding cell, shackled at the wrists and ankles, and escorted into the execution chamber. At precisely 6 p.m., Danielle Simpson entered the lethal injection chamber of the Huntsville Walls Unit. The room was stark, clinical, painted in pale green, with the centerpiece being a gurney outfitted with heavy leather straps. Prison officials laid Simpson down, securing his arms and legs, while medical personnel inserted IV lines into his arms that would soon carry the lethal combination of chemicals into his bloodstream. Just feet away, separated by glass, sat the witnesses, family members, attorneys, journalists, and representatives of the victim's family, each waiting in silence to hear his final words and watch the state carry out its sentence. When the warden asked if he had a final statement, Simpson spoke with a steady voice. "I want to tell my family I love y'all. I'm going to miss y'all. I'm ready." He expressed love not only to his family but also to one of his attorneys who had stood by him through the long appeals process. Notably, however, he did not acknowledge the family of Geraldine Davidson, the woman whose life he had stolen so brutally nearly a decade earlier. His words were brief, and when he finished, he lay back on the gurney, eyes toward the ceiling, as the warden gave the signal to begin the execution. The chemicals began to flow through the IV lines, and within seconds Simpson's breathing slowed. Witnesses reported that he exhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling a few times before his body grew still. The process was clinical, efficient, and silent. 9 minutes later, at 6:32 p.m. Central Standard Time, Danielle Nathaniel Simpson was officially pronounced dead. The guards and medical staff moved with practiced precision, removing equipment and clearing the chamber, while witnesses sat in the heavy quiet of what they had just observed. For the family of Geraldine Davidson, those moments brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some felt relief that justice had finally been carried out after years of legal delays and appeals, closure for a wound that had never truly healed. Others felt only sadness, knowing that no punishment, no matter how final, could ever bring back the woman they loved. Davidson had been a schoolteacher, a neighbor, a church organist, a woman remembered for kindness and devotion, and her loss would always leave an empty place in the community of Palestine, Texas. As Simpson's body was wheeled away from the chamber, the prison gates slowly reopened, releasing reporters to deliver the news to the waiting world. Danielle Nathaniel Simpson, executed for the capital murder of Geraldine Davidson. Inside those walls, the chapter of his life was closed, but outside, the memory of the crime, and the woman whose life had been so cruelly ended, remained. That was the tragic story of Danielle Simpson and the murder of Geraldine Davidson. A case that shook a small Texas town to its core and left behind questions of justice, morality, and the price of cruelty. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? Did the punishment fit the crime? Or do you believe justice could never truly be served for a life so brutally taken? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. Your perspective matters. And if you found this story powerful and eye-opening, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another in-depth look at cases that continue to haunt communities across America. Turn on the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when we drop a new true crime story.